So I'm here with my friend Jack Malcolm, who has had an interesting run in sales. And he'll tell you a little bit about it in a second. But I've been a fan of Jack's writing. I've been a fan of his thinking about how people can really accomplish a lot in their business selling if they do some things that he's spent a lot of time thinking about. So I'm delighted that he's here. One of the things about Jack that I think I discovered in the second time I talked to him was that he is an ex-banker, which is important. He also has an interesting way of thinking about how he got into what he was doing. So Jack, I'm gonna turn it over to you. You're an ex-banker. How did you get into banking?
Well, I got into banking, and it's funny because I make a living by training salespeople, and I got into banking specifically to avoid having to sell to salespeople. And not to date myself, but I started out my career in banking in 1980. So if you'll recall, in 1980, this was before Congress had deregulated the banking industry. And I got into it because I thought I was a very introverted person. I like crunching numbers. I got an MBA in finance, and I figured I can go into the banking industry because my dad used to be a banker, and I remember he would sit at a desk and people would come to him and ask to borrow money, and he could say yes or he could say no, but he didn't have to sell to anybody. So I said, this is the perfect career for me. And I got into it, and my historical memory may be hazy on the details, but I remember, I think it was called Regulation Q, that Congress passed a series of sweeping changes to the banking industry. And suddenly we had to go out and compete for business. And my bosses said, you need to go out and you need to sell bank services. And I said, I don't want to sell bank services. And they said, well, do you want to remain employed? And I said, I guess I want to sell bank services. So I went out there, no training. I knocked on doors. And back in those days, there was no internet. You could call people on the phone, but it was pretty much drive around and call on businesses and everything like that. And I made probably every mistake in the book. But I gradually got a little bit better at it, but I never really saw sales as a craft until one day, and this was totally by accident. I wasn't expecting this. I was working for a bank at the time. It was Southeast Bank, which was the largest bank in Florida at the time. So I got in to see the owner of about a $50 million company. And it wasn't because I was great at prospecting or cold calling or anything like that. But, when you work for the biggest bank, yeah, people say, sure, I'll talk to you. So I walked in there, had the initial pleasantries, the common ground, et cetera. And then finally he says to me, okay, tell me why I should do business with you. And I looked him straight in the eye, and without even thinking about what's coming out of my mouth next, I said, I don't know. And it was a very uncomfortable silence for about 5 seconds. It felt like hours. Yeah. But he looked at me and he said, wait a minute. You want me to do business with you, but you can't tell me why I should do business with you? So in that 5 seconds, my mind is cranking. I'm trying to think, how do I get out of this without looking like a complete idiot? So I said, well, sir, I have a lot of clients that are very happy with the services that our bank can provide. I've helped some with loans to grow their business. I've helped some with cash management services to improve their cash flow. I've helped some with investment services. Until I know more about you and your business, I don't know if you should bank with me. Do you mind if I ask you some questions? And he said, well, that's an interesting approach. Never heard that one before. Go ahead, ask me some questions. And then I had to kind of scramble to think of semi-intelligent questions. And remember, this was in the days before internet, so I couldn't say, well, I see on your website that you've been in business for 14 years and your goals are to do this, this, and this. I had to come up with semi-intelligent questions. I must have done a good job because he gave me a piece of business. He said, I like your approach. I'll give you a shot. He turned out to be one of my most important relationships at the bank. And that's the day that I began very interested in sales as wow, there's something to this, and let me learn more about this. I signed up for the sales training that the bank offered, and then gradually I got certified in delivering the sales training on behalf of the bank, and that kind of in some ways led to where I am today.
That's a great story, and it probably rivals the experience of a lot of bankers today, not just people that started in banking when you and I did, but people that started more recently, and they sometimes benefit from great training.
Mm.
They sometimes benefit from the opportunity that you were confronted with to have to really figure out what the answer to the question is. And
Yep.
one of the things that you've written about, which I found fascinating, is something you call outside-in thinking. Does that tie into this? I think it does.
Oh, it absolutely ties into it. In fact, that was kind of I didn't call it that at the time, but that's when outside in thinking became my approach to sales. And my approach is, especially if you're selling something like banking services, and it's been a long time since I've been a banker, but I assume it probably hasn't changed that much, that we're selling almost as close to a commodity as you can get, because you're selling money. And what's more of a commodity than money by definition? And not only that, but then after you sell it, you have to get it back. So
A very important consideration, an unusual sales opportunity.
Exactly. So I learned that it wasn't about myself and my services, because everything that I said about my banking services, somebody else could walk in an hour later and say the exact same thing about their bank. So I learned that if I was going to spend all the time talking about my bank and how great it was, I wasn't getting anywhere. And I learned it's about talking to them about their business. I do a little thing in my training classes, which people get a chuckle, but then they think. I say, how many of you have kids? And a lot of people in the class raise their hands. I say, how many of you like talking about your kids? And they all raise their hands. And then I say, how many of you like hearing other people talk about their kids? Very few hands get raised.
Right.
And that's the whole point. When you're talking to your customers, your clients, whatever you call them, get them talking about themselves, get them talking about what they care about, what they're trying to accomplish, what is keeping them from getting there. That's when you're going to uncover needs that you can then connect to.
So the outside in is sort of putting yourself in their shoes. It ties into sort of mind melds, or you used the term once with me, cognitive empathy.
Exactly. And cognitive empathy is the psychological term. There's a great book by Daniel Goleman. He's the one who came up with the idea of emotional intelligence. He's got a book called Focus, and he talks about 3 types of empathy. There's the emotional empathy, which is what most of us think of as empathy. There's emotional caring. It's one thing to know what another person is feeling. It's another thing to actually care about that. And then there's cognitive empathy, which is being able to think how the other person is thinking. Another term for it, not to overcomplicate things, is perspective taking. So perspective taking, outside in thinking, cognitive empathy, it's all the same thing. It's trying to see the situation from the other person's point of view. And it's been proven in a lot of psychological experiments, like, for example, they'll do mock negotiations. The people who can take the outside in thinking approach are better at coming up with win-win solutions where both sides generate much more value together than they would when each side is just trying to get the most for themselves.